Ose shalom, shalom, Pogromnacht, Ose shalom aleinu. Ose shalom, shalom, Pogromnacht, Ose shalom aleinu. Ve'al kol Yisrael.
Stick this here so that I realized I left it in.
Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Amen, amen, amen. Ose shalom, shalom, Pogromnacht, Ose shalom aleinu. Ose shalom, shalom, Pogromnacht, Ose shalom aleinu. Ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. Ve'al kol yoshvei tevel ve'imru amen. Hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Amen, 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 amen.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Or Hadash Pogromnacht commemoration happening today on November 7th at Or Hadash Synagogue in Fort Washington. My name is Sarah Bramerschley. I am serving as the rabbi here while Rabbi Alana is on family leave, and it's a real honor to be with you all today. And I first want to start by thanking everyone who's here today and everyone who has made this event happen. The Holocaust Education Committee here at Or Hadash, the Holocaust Awareness Museum and Education Center, Mr. Ralph Franklin, who is a Holocaust survivor who will be speaking with us today, and the Smile School as well. And in person today, we have students from grades 4 through 6 and their parents and teachers here. And we also are on YouTube Live, where people potentially around the country are here with us today in this space. And just a logistics note, we have Josh McHugh and Maura Adam, who is going to be helping with some of the tech today. And so if there's ever, for folks on YouTube, if you have any tech issues that come up, just go ahead and put that in the chat and they will address those. And one reason that we have this event today is that as a community at Or Hadash, we think it is really vital for students and young people to learn about the history of our people, and that includes the history of the Holocaust. And when we're given the opportunity to hear from someone who experienced this firsthand, we think it is really, really crucial to take that opportunity. And so we thank Mr. Franklin for being with us today. You might have noticed that we've been calling this event Pogromnacht instead of Kristallnacht. So Kristallnacht was a horrific event that happened on November 9th in 1938 in Germany, where there was violence in the streets and the homes and the shops of Jews, and really catalysted a period of intense violence for our people. And that is the name that Nazis gave to this event, which literally translates as a night of broken glass. And there has been a push in the Jewish community to call it Pogromnacht, as it is more fitting to say that this was an event full of racism and hate that was with intensified violence, and that there is power in naming our own experience and our own history. And that is deeply rooted in Torah as well. Throughout Torah, we have stories of naming as a way to mark moments. We have at the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, that we called the mountain, Abraham called the mountain where this very traumatic thing happened, Adonai Yereh, God sees. That naming is actually something that is very important to give us an accurate portrayal of our experience and our story about how we want to talk about it. And today, as I said, we'll be hearing from Holocaust survivor Ralph Franklin, and he will speak to us about his experience. And as I reflected and prepared for this day and prepared to hear from him, I was thinking about how rooted it is in Jewish tradition and history to share these stories or in an oral tradition, that is really key to who we are as a people. Way back in the day, Torah used to be recited in a public place. People would have scrolls and read out Torah. And some of this was done by actually reading on the scroll, and some of this was done by memory and saying, I heard these stories from my parents, I'm passing them on to you. And that is true for other texts for our people as well, that we pass on our traditions orally. And so it is a true privilege today to be able to hear from Mr. Franklin. And the term Lador Vador, from generation to generation, comes to me, that we're hearing from older generations about their experiences. And as young people, you're taking on those stories and passing those on to future generations as well. So on that note of Lador Vador, I want to invite up Maura Barbara, who is going to be lighting our communal yard site candle today.
Thank you, Rabbi Sarah. Today, I light this yard site candle to honor the blessed memory of the 6 million Jewish souls murdered by the Nazis during the Shoah. This particular candle comes to us from a project of Maccabi, and we thank Jed Margolius for introducing us to that project and providing us with the candles. Each candle represents a life lost to hatred and intolerance during the Shoah. This candle honors the blessed memory of Neni Lazer of Grabovich, Poland, born to parents Hannah and Israel David. Neni was murdered in Majdanek death camp in 1942 at the age of 25. We hold Neni in our hearts as we remember her, along with all the other victims of the Shoah today. We pledge to fight anti-Semitism, hatred, and bigotry to honor their blessed memories. May their memories be for a blessing, as we all pledge to never forget. Maccabi asks us to reuse the tin that houses this candle as a planter and plant something lovely in it to honor Neni's life and add beauty to our world. So at Or Hadash, and specifically in our Smile School, we are committed to Holocaust education. This morning, students have been invited to take notes with questions, reflections, and even sketches if they choose. Anyone is welcome to take paper and writing implements from the table right outside this room to join the students in this exercise. At the end of Mr. Franklin's testimony, you may refer to your notes and questions to ask Mr. Franklin during the Q&A session of our program. And I also invite you to share any sketches with Mr. Franklin, either today or at a future date. At Or Hadash, we teach our students that it is their responsibility to bear witness to the testimonies of the Shoah and seek to fight injustice throughout our community and world. At Or Hadash, we are committed to teach and to do in order to ensure that the world never forgets. Our students learn that it is a crucial part of their heritage as Jews to bear witness to these testimonies and pass them along with our other sacred teachings. Our Holocaust Education Committee, chaired by Dr. Dan Schwartz, together with the Education Steering Committee, or ESC as we call it, exists as a collective, unified force to teach our students about the Shoah and to recognize and fight against hatred and injustice in our world. We teach our students to speak out and act in order to protect the vulnerable in the hope that the horrors of the Shoah not be repeated again. And in doing so, we honor the memory of the 6 million Jewish souls who were murdered at the time of the Shoah. It is my honor to now introduce Dr. Dan Schwartz to say a few words and to introduce our esteemed speaker, Mr. Ralph Franklin.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and to Rabbi Sarah. And I want to welcome everyone from the Smile School and families, parents, grandparents who are in attendance today. It's wonderful to see so many people at Or Hadash in person. And also to our YouTube live stream attendees. I know that we have people live streaming from all over the country and also from Israel. My father, who lives in Israel, is with us all the way from Israel. So welcome to everyone. I want to also thank Jeff Quinn and Ruth Almy from HAMAC, the Holocaust Awareness Museum and Education Center, for coordinating Mr. Franklin's presentation today. As chair of the Holocaust Education Committee at Or Hadash, I want to invite anyone interested in joining our committee. We need help with the organization of our new Holocaust Education Library, especially in cataloging our books and Yiddish music. Anyone interested in joining our committee and sharing your ideas can contact me. So why is it so important to commemorate what has been called Kristallnacht, now Pogromnacht, that took place in November, early November the 9th, 1938? This devastating attack on Jewish synagogues and buildings in Germany and Austria thrust Europe and the world hurling towards World War II. Hearing our guest speaker today, Mr. Franklin's memories of Pogromnacht, is our opportunity as a community to recall this historic event so that we can shed light on the process of oppression and genocide so that it will never happen again. Given our own experience in this country, including January 6th of this year, an attack on our democracy and an attempt to overthrow our election, and the perseveration of anti-Semitic incidents that continues in our country and in the world, we must remember and stand up for truth and justice. I'm honored to introduce to you Mr. Franklin, who will speak to us for about 45 minutes. We will all then have the opportunity to ask him questions. You can also share your reflections and responses with Mr. Franklin today. Please have your questions and comments ready to share in the chat if you are on YouTube live stream. Those in person have paper and pencil to write or draw your responses. It is now my pleasure to introduce Holocaust survivor, Mr. Ralph Franklin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a beautiful morning, and it's hard to imagine that so many mornings were not so beautiful for us. I'm now 93 years old. I was 13 when I came to Philadelphia. But let's go back a little bit. I was born in March 1928 in a little town called Schlochau. This little town had about 6,000 people in it. It was located in the most eastern part of Germany, in a province called Westpreußen, which really means West Prussia, but was actually located in eastern Germany. There were several Jewish families, but it was primarily non-Jews who were farmers or otherwise involved in agricultural activities. It was not the manufacturing center, it was agricultural. A lot of people had little farms or worked for farmers. when I was 5 years old, my parents enrolled me in a private kindergarten, which was available to anyone who had the money to pay for it. And at age 6, I entered public school, like everybody else who was age 6. I was the only Jewish child in what we then called what was really first grade. I did all right. Schoolwork was always the same for everyone. I got good marks, and time came for promotion to second grade. We had a little party, we celebrated that I completed first grade. In the meantime, my father worked for his father, and my grandfather owned a business which catered to the general population, farmers. He had a grain mill. The farmers would come in with their rye and their wheat, and he would grind it down to make available to them flour, which they could then sell to the bakery chains. And that was my grandfather's business. My father worked for him as the office manager, and everything went along fine until it didn't work out so fine anymore. In the meantime, unfortunately, and having nothing to do with the times of the day, my parents separated, and my mother took me with her to live with her parents in another little place, actually a very small village, in the next county. And here I did most of my growing up, that part of it, which I could remember. I went to that public school starting in second grade. This was a very small village, too small to call it a town. And maybe 900 to 1,000 people lived in this village. And there was a school, a 3-room schoolhouse, 3 teachers, 2 regular teachers, and 1 principal who was called the head teacher. And this was 1937. And then comes November 1938. By that time, I was in the equivalent of 5th grade. I went to class. Everybody else was in the room. Everybody had their books open in front of them. And the teacher, who was actually the principal, there were 3 teachers, one of whom acted as principal. They were all very decent people. They were nice to me. They were tough on everyone. If you made a mistake, any kind of mistake, spelling, arithmetic, you got hit. This was the way it was. They had to open up your hand, and they took a stick and whoosh, right down the middle of your hand, and you would never make that same mistake again. You would remember the correct spelling or the correct addition or subtraction. Anyhow, here I was with the rest of the kids in school in what would be considered 5th grade. And the teacher, who was really the principal, called me up to his desk just before class was to start. And he said, in so many words, there's been a new law passed, and this law states that Jewish children can no longer go to public schools. And I was the only Jewish child in that whole school. So he said it in about as nice a way as he possibly could, but it was a shock to me. I couldn't understand why, what did I do? What did Jewish children do to him or to other children? But I had no chance to get an answer to that question. I took my books and I started walking home. very befuddled, very difficult for me to understand why, what happened. So I went home, long walk. I walked home. As I came home, this was at my mother's father's business, who had a plowshare factory, again catering to the agricultural population of that area. So I got home, an unusual thing I noticed as I came across the bridge to our house. There were 3 cars parked in front of our house. There was only 1 car owned in our part of the village, and that was our car. And these were 3 cars of strangers. Well, I couldn't spend time contemplating what's going on, so I just went in the house. And there was my mother sitting here, my grandmother sitting here, and my aunt sitting here, and one man standing in the corner, just standing there, a man I'd never seen before. And I walked up to my mother and I said, "What's going on? What's happening?" And before she could even answer, this guy in the corner walked over. He said, "Sit down and shut up." So I sat down and I was quiet. And I still had no idea what was going on, but I heard noises in other parts of the house. And it turned out these noises were other people breaking furniture, smashing up pictures hanging on the wall. They took some kind of axe and smashed a huge mirror we had hanging in the hallway. And they broke a lot of things which were near and dear to us, which were part of our lives. And I had no idea why, what did we do? Did we do something terrible that caused these people to destroy our property? Well, they didn't destroy the house, because by that time, the house itself was under agreement of sale to a non-Jewish person. And so they left the house itself alone. They did not break windows. They broke the type of things which were personal to us, primarily pictures. Finally, it seemed like many hours, but it wasn't quite that long. These guys, they were all in civilian clothes, by the way, no soldiers, no policemen, at least not in uniform. They all got together and left. They got into their 3 cars and were ready to drive off. When I noticed that my uncle and my father had been arrested and were in one of those 3 cars. And as they left, they were being taken along. And then I asked my mother and grandmother, and they said bad things are happening, and they were only afraid of what might happen to my father and my uncle. We didn't know. We found out later they were arrested just because they were Jews. They had not committed any crimes. They were taken from the small town where we were and sent to a concentration camp. Now, what is that word that's been around for a while? A lot of people here in Pennsylvania have heard the word concentration camp, but what was it? It's actually a prison camp, a camp where you had barrack type quarters, not individual cells, but big barracks where the prisoners were being kept. The prisoners didn't commit any crimes. They were Jews. That's why they were there. Turned out later, we found out there were some other non-desirable people there, gypsies, people who were considered to be communists, anyone else that made some kind of remarks against the government being Hitler and his group. And so we didn't know at the time where they were being sent, but the place happened to be called Sachsenhausen, which was in or near the town of Oranienburg, which was north of Berlin in central Germany. But we didn't know it at the time. It was even more terrible because we didn't know what was happening, and we couldn't ask a question. Nobody would talk to us. Finally, actually, I believe it was almost like 2 weeks afterwards, we got a letter from my uncle. He says, "We are alive, we're working hard, we have a place to sleep, and they're giving us food, and don't worry." Well, the don't worry part obviously was trying to help us understand what's happening, although we couldn't understand. They did not commit any crime, and as far as we could find out, the husbands, fathers, and other men from the community were also in a place like that. And these are called concentration camp, but that's just a word. There's no rhyme or reason for this. And we just had to stand by and hope that our relatives would be released. But that didn't happen. In the meantime, our business was already under like the equivalent of an agreement of sale. We had to get rid of our business because Jews weren't allowed to have a business. And the house too. The house and the business were under agreement of sale, but the sale had not actually been completed yet. When the time came that this sale, in quotation marks, sale, was to take place, there was a problem. The buyer started to ask questions about the business. Now, who was the owner? Legally or technically, my grandmother was now the owner of the business. But my grandmother knew nothing about producing plowshares or running a farm or doing any of the other things which the owner had to know and tell the new owner so that the new owner could continue a very good business. So my mother went to the Gestapo, went to their headquarters, and she said, what should we do? The new owner, who is a good Nazi, he wants answers about this business, how to manufacture plowshares and how to do this or how to do that. And I don't know anything about it. My mother, who is the owner of the business, she knows nothing about it. She's a good cook, she's a good housekeeper, but she knows nothing about how to make a plowshare. So the only one who really knew how to run the business end of the business was my uncle. My uncle was in a concentration camp. She told these police officers the situation. And finally, they said, okay, we'll send him home so he can help the new owner, who is a good Nazi, so he can continue this business. Well, good Nazi or not, we were happy to hear that my uncle would be coming home, and he did. My father was not involved with this. He was in a separate business. My parents had separated at that time. So one day, here comes my uncle, all bandaged up. His hands are frozen, but they're all in white bandages. And here he came, and he was happy, and we were all happy. Terrible to see him in such a condition, but at least he was home. Excuse me. So he came home, his hands started to heal, and he started to tell us about the terrible conditions at the camp. They had hard work. They were building roads. It was a work camp, a slave labor camp. There was no, they were not being killed, but they were made to work very hard. And they didn't have proper gloves or other things. This was winter time. This was December with a cold winter. Anyway, he was home. The sale of the business did go through properly. The buyer himself was a pretty decent person, but he took advantage. He paid practically nothing. He paid enough to pay off the bank loan, and there was no money left for us to live on. Because why should he pay money when he knew he could get this place anyhow? So we had no real money, but my mother and had arranged by that time, shortly after that time, to send me to the nearest provincial city so that I can get back to some kind of education, because there was a Jewish community there, and they arranged some sort of schooling for the children of the Jewish faith. So I was in the name of the town of Schneidermühl. I was going to school there. My mother and grandmother and uncle at that point had to get out. The house was sold, the business was sold. They had no right to live there anymore. So they got on a train and ended up in Berlin, a big city, bigger than Philadelphia, about double the size of Philadelphia. And they got a little apartment, actually there were sub renters from a Jewish family, which had a large apartment. And my uncle had made an application which was approved, and somehow he got to England. I don't know the details, but all I know is who was left: my grandmother, my mother, and I. And we had all made application to get out of the country. As far as the Nazis were concerned, they wanted to get rid of Jews. They didn't care how. If the Jews couldn't leave, they would send them to these camps where many of them died. So we lived in Berlin in two rooms we had. My grandmother was the first one to be called by the American consulate that her application to go to the United States had been approved and she should be ready to leave. And she did. Now, how did this all work out? With my uncles, we had originally 4 uncles. 2 of them were still alive. These were my grandmother's brothers, my great uncles. They all lived in Philadelphia. They all had a business in Philadelphia. And the 2 remaining uncles signed an affidavit of support for all of us. But my grandmother was their closest relative, and the American authorities approved her first of us, and she was able to come to the United States. And she ended up getting a ship out of Italy, out of Genoa, I believe, and off she went. It was we were happy that she could get out, but it was a sad goodbye. So that left my mother, my father, and myself, and my parents were separated, but I saw them both. And I was living with my mother in a small sub rental with a Jewish family. And I went to synagogue, one of the remaining synagogues, which was an Orthodox synagogue, and it was within walking distance. Every Shabbat, our landlord in our apartment who was Orthodox used to take me and we walked to the synagogue. And that was my first experience of an Orthodox synagogue. So things happen in every family. Sooner or later there were problems. And my mother decided it's time to move to find another place to live. And we went around the corner, actually, another Jewish family. And we rented one room and had the privilege of using their kitchen from time to time. So it was just my mother and myself. My father lived elsewhere in the city. So here I was in Berlin, big city, 4 million people. So what does a kid do? I did get to school. We had this time it was a Reform congregation that formed a school, and it was called the Joseph Lehmann Schule. This school had real good teachers. Most of these teachers had been fired from their regular public school jobs because they were Jews. So we had good Jewish teachers and the courses were good. And I had math and history and the language, German language. And I was by that time in 6th grade. And we had a foreign language as one of our classes. The foreign language turned out to be English. Well, I did very well in my math, in my German language, history, geography, all the usual classes. I got the equivalent of A's and B's. Then there was English. This was difficult. I could hardly stay with it. I thought I would flunk out. I didn't flunk out, but I did very poorly. I just about got the equivalent of a D. And I thought to myself, what a terrible language. How can anyone ever learn this language and speak this language? Somehow the words, the vowels, the consonants are pronounced different from other languages, because I knew some kids that had taken Spanish in school, and that was easy, I think, because an A was always an A, and an I was always an I, and but that was not the case with English. After all, the letter A could be ah, like in father, or it could be A, like in able. How do you know which it is? Well, I didn't. Somehow I passed with a very poor grade, but I passed. And my mother tried to help me with the English language. My mother, it turns out, had been in the United States for a better part, almost for a year, when she was a teenager to visit her uncles. There had been 4 uncles that moved to the United States around 1900, 1901. And so she visited them, and when she was here, she was in Philadelphia, in Oak Lane. And she learned English, and she took a course at Temple University. So she tried to help me with my English lessons. We didn't know if we'd ever get to America, but we were always hoping we could. And we had an application with the American consulate to come to the United States. The American government was not happy about immigrants at that time. This is not exactly a new story, but it was a tough situation there. Congress was not in favor of having a lot of refugees coming into the country. So we didn't know what would happen to us. But my uncles were good to us. I mean, they signed an affidavit of support, which would show the government of the United States that if they let us into the country, we would not be going on public assistance. We would not need the government to give us food or lodging, that someone in the family would be taking care of us. So my uncles, there were two left. Two had died in the meantime. My two uncles were hoping to get us over to this country. The government looked over the papers and said, okay, these two people that are ready to support these refugees, they're old people. What happens when they die? Then these refugees will be asking the government for help. We can't do that. We don't want that. So the sons of my uncles who didn't know us from Adam, they were willing to co-sign the affidavit of support. Now this was okay for the government. One of them was a doctor, one of them was an architect. They made a good living. These people are relatively young people. They will be around a long time to take care of these refugees if these people need help. So that was enough for the government to approve the immigration status, but there was still a time period that we couldn't control. We had to wait for our number to come up. And we kept checking with the consulate. Nope, your number's not up yet. Be patient. Well, it's hard to be patient under those conditions. The Nazis were, as you probably know by now, a very cruel group of people. Nazis actually was a political party to start with, but they were the ones who had great hatred for Jews. And they passed all kinds of laws in quotation marks, that made it difficult for Jews to exist. One of such laws was, well, one day we had to turn in our radio. Jews weren't allowed to have a radio anymore. And a couple of weeks later, they sent a man out to take out our telephone. Telephones were not for Jews. But then came the good news. The letter came from the consulate that our number was coming up and we should get ready to make an appearance. They want to interview us, make sure we're fit and ready to come to the United States. Now, my parents were separated, but they only would accept us as a whole family unit. So my mother talked to my father and for him it was good news that he would be able to come to the United States with us as a family unit. But where was my father? He was still in the concentration camp. At that time, the United States was not yet at war. My mother went to the consulate, and they already knew her by now. And she explained that my father is supposed to make an appearance at the consulate, but he's in a concentration camp. He can't make the appearance. Well, she had certain documents that asked for us all to be there, even me, and I was only 12 years old. So my mother took the letter to the Gestapo, and they said, okay, we want all Jews out of Germany. He can come home from the concentration camp, and he can come to the consulate, and we can get rid of him. So, of course, he was very happy. He was not in very good physical shape, but he came home, and on a certain day, we all went to the consulate. And with my very little English that I did remember from school, I said thank you and a few other things. And we were ready. We got our papers. We got our passports stamped. Passports, by the way, which were German, passports since we were in Germany, but they were all stamped with a big J, J for Jude, which is Jew. In the meantime, our ration cards for food were always also stamped with J. Now, later, after we left, they made Jews wear the star. That was after we left. That was not the case when we were living there. But people always ask me about that. Anyhow, so we're ready to come to the United States. What's the next step? We had to pack a suitcase. We could only take one suitcase per person. That's it. We certainly couldn't take any furniture or anything else. One suitcase per person. Didn't matter. We were on our way out of this terrible country. Now, I was almost 13. I had been going to some kind of Hebrew school because it was almost time for me to be bar mitzvah. Whether I ever could be bar mitzvah, I didn't know. But I took lessons, Hebrew lessons, Jewish history lessons, and my parents wanted to be sure that I had this education. So there was a rabbi who was a Reform rabbi, but he's the only one we could get a hold of who gave me lessons. He would come to the house and teach me Bible lessons. Now I was getting close to being bar mitzvah. I was 12 years old. By the way, what does an 11 and 12-year-old kid do for recreation? Here? Well, I guess you can go to the movies. You can play games. You can play sports. That was not possible there. What could I do? I rode trolley cars. I rode buses. I did things where nobody asked, "What religion are you?" And I got to know the city very well. But I could not go to a museum. I could not go to a library. I could not do any of the things that most kids my age could do. Fortunately, there was a little bookstore walking distance from my apartment that also had a little lending library. And that lady who ran that little store was very nice. She let me borrow books. And what did I borrow? American Wild West stories, Indian cowboys. And that was my type of reading that I did. Of course, all in the German language. I couldn't really do well in English yet. And when we had to pack our things, the government sent over an old, semi-retired customs official who was supposed to sit in and watch us pack to make sure we packed nothing that wasn't supposed to go. And what was not supposed to go? Anything in print. No books, no newspapers even. We weren't allowed to wrap anything up in a newspaper. Nothing in print was supposed to leave the country. Well, my mother got this old man into the kitchen, gave him a shot of liquor, and while he was out of the room, I shoved a couple of books into my underwear on my suitcase, my couple of Indian stories, cowboy and Indian stories. He never saw it. And here I was a criminal. I took something that I wasn't supposed to take, but then again, I was 12 years old. And it was time to get for my bar mitzvah to come up, but they told us the date that we would be leaving the country. Now, this was an organization which was part of the HIAS. Some of you may have heard of HIAS, H-I-A-S. HIAS is still in business. HIAS takes care of refugees and people who need help in coming to this country. And they helped. They didn't pay for our trip. My uncles paid for that, but they did all the detail work. They made it possible for us to get on that train and get on that ship later. And they took care of the details. So when it came time to leave, we got a date, March 11th. And I was supposed to be bar mitzvah. My birthday was March 15th. So the rabbi made arrangements where he could. Ended up he was Reform. They ended up getting me into a conservative synagogue, and I had my bar mitzvah there. So what was my bar mitzvah? Well, I read my Torah portion. I had been coached, and I was able to do that. I did my Hebrew Torah portion. And what else happens on the bar mitzvah? Well, here, people get presents. People have a cake. People have a party. I had none of those. Our baggage was already packed and sealed. We couldn't add anything to it. So there were no sense taking presents or getting presents. Cake, couldn't find a cake if you tried. Anyhow, I had my bar mitzvah. I said my Torah portion. I did my prayer. The rabbi made a very wonderful speech. And he said, of course in German, never forget what you have seen here. Always remember you are a Jew. It was very moving speech. Went home and waited 2-3 more days until we were to meet at a certain train station in Berlin, and they assigned us a car, a train car to go into, and the train would move out that night. It did. This was the third class compartment, wooden chairs, but chairs, seats. It was a real passenger train, and we started out. As we left Berlin, we could hear the bombing in the distance. The RAF, the Royal Air Force, had arrived, as they had many other occasions. They were bombing Berlin pretty regularly, but never did we actually see any real damage. So we were glad to leave for many, many reasons, of course, mainly to get out of the country, but also to get away from the bombing. And here we go through Western Germany, then into France, occupied France. Germany had already defeated France in the war. And we got into Paris, all blacked out. And the next morning, the train went on into southern France. And just before we got to the border between occupied France and free Spain, something happened. Many of the people in our train, many of these German Jewish refugees with us, opened the windows and threw out money out the window. How did this happen? We were limited in what we were allowed to take out of the country. Certain amount of clothing, certain amount of this and that, and money. 10 German marks was what we were allowed to take out of the country. 10 marks. What did we do without 10 marks? The consulate people sent us down the street just a day or two before we left. And they said, here is an American company in Berlin called American Express. They will take your 10 marks and they will give you American money, American dollars. And they did. $4. Every person could take out $4. My mother had $4. My father took $4, and I got $4. Can you imagine starting a new life with $4? Of course, we had our uncles, but we didn't rely on our uncles, but we had to, at least for a few days. Okay, so here we were on our way to Lisbon. Lisbon is the capital of Portugal. That's a seaport. That's where a ship was supposed to take us to America. They hire us people, put us up in a hotel, and we got wonderful food compared to what we were used to in Germany. And we had a nice room. Here we were in Lisbon, very beautiful city, sunshine, summertime, even though it was only March. On March 15th, the day we crossed our final international border from Spain into Portugal, that was my birthday. Happy birthday. Okay, in Portugal, I was able to walk on nice sunny streets, and I had my $4, and I bought a candy bar. Now I had $3.95. But anyhow, the day came when we were told the buses will take us to the ship. This was a couple of weeks after we got to Lisbon. And indeed, we were taken to a ship, a Portuguese ship, a passenger ship, not a very big ship, but a ship going to America. So we got a cabin, not a fancy one, but we got a place with beds. And we were told which dining room we would eat our meals, not the fancy one, but a small dining room for third-class passengers. And we ate. We got food that we had not been able to get in Germany for some time. I remember that I had eggs. We couldn't buy eggs in Berlin, but here we got eggs for breakfast on the ship. And the ship itself, to me, as a 13-year-old, was a wonderful experience. I used to sneak over to the other part of the ship, which was for first-class passengers, because there they had a phonograph and they played music, American music, which I never heard before. And I used to sit on the floor in this big room and watched the young rich people dance. And I sat there and listened to the music. And then one day, the trip itself was uneventful. It took about 12 days, 13 days. On the last day of the voyage, my mother called me up on deck and she pointed. She said, "Look over there, the Statue of Liberty. We're in America. We made it." And we were really happy. And later that morning, we got into a dock in Brooklyn, New York, and we were told to get all our stuff together, that we're going to get off the ship, and we are now in America. There'll be some American officers that we have to talk to. They'll ask some questions, but we're in America. That's right. We were here in Brooklyn, New York, and also my uncles were there and my cousins. They were all there to welcome us. And we had they took us to a restaurant and they had coffee. I never had coffee. My parents found all coffee was a real luxury. We never had coffee in Berlin, but now in New York, United States of America, here was coffee. I had milk. I did get some kind of milk in Germany, but this was real good milk. And it was real good cake. And I loved cake. So here we were. It really happened. And later that day, my uncle and his son, my cousin, took us to the city of Philadelphia. I'd heard of it, but I really didn't know much about it. Turned out it's a big city, half the size of Berlin, pretty big. And the first few days, we lived in their house in Philadelphia. But my mother and father did not want to be a burden to them, and they both were able to get a job. They separated again. They had been separated in the past. My father got a factory job, the lamp factory in New Jersey. My mother got a job as a maid in Philadelphia. And so in order not to be a burden to my uncle, who was ready to take care of us, they both got jobs. My grandmother, who had gotten out earlier, as I said, was living with my uncle, and now so was I. I had my own room, and she had her own room in his house in North Philadelphia. And here we were. The next step was, after all, I was by now 13 years old, got to go to school. Now, fortunately, my cousin's wife was very efficient in such things. She got me enrolled. She got me into public school. I got into 8th grade. I could hardly speak any English, but it turned out that in this class, there was one kid, same age as me, who was also a German refugee, but he had been in this country for a year or two. He spoke English. And he and the teachers put me next to his desk in the classroom so that he could translate the lessons to me and I could learn whatever I could learn. This was so-so. This worked out to some extent. But for a 13-year-old, it's easy to learn English or any language when you're in a classroom with everybody speaks that language, and nobody could speak German. So I started to learn the language, whether I liked it or not, and I did like it, but I never originally thought I could do it, but I did. How much time do I have? Approximately. Huh? Huh? 10 minutes. Okay, I have a few more minutes to talk to you. The lessons in my 8th grade at the Clymer School went pretty good. I was better off in the written work than in the oral work, but it didn't take me long. When you're 13 years old, it's easy to learn a language, especially if everybody around you speaks that language. And then I went on and went to Cook Junior High School for 1 year, and I ended up at Central High School for 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, the 185th class of Central High School. And finally, I ended up going to Temple University, and I majored in business, the School of Business and Public Administration, majoring in accounting. I graduated from Temple with a degree, which I never would have imagined when I first came over to this country. But I did. I got a job. I started making some money. And here I was, a young man, dating girls and having the life of an American. Of course, I never forgot my earlier life, and I still haven't forgotten. I never will. But I was on my way to be an American. Our name was very unusual. It was called, my name originally was, my name was Freundlich. Well, my relatives said, Freundlich is no good. It's a wonderful word in German, but no Americans won't be able to say that word. They won't be able to spell that word. Change your name. And they suggested very nicely to change it to a good American name, Franklin. That's about as American as you can get. That was fine with me because no one's going to make fun of my name anymore. So here I was, and I changed it to Franklin. And at Temple, I graduated as Rudolph Franklin. Ralph is my nickname, by the way. Everybody calls me Ralph, but my first name I never changed. It's still Rudolph. And here I was having had a job in a real estate office, and I specialized in the insurance part of that office. And later, I formed my own insurance agency, and I did the insurance work for the business that I was working for. And finally, I started my own business, and I specialized in motorcycle and recreational vehicle insurance. And I got to be pretty well known. Had an office on Girard Avenue, and later on on Huntington Pike in Rockledge. And then there was one day when I was taken by a friend of mine to a synagogue dance. I didn't like dancing, but I liked meeting people. And I met someone, and that someone turned out to be my wife now. So now I have a wife, I have 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and I am an American. It's hard for me to remember that I once was not an American. So that's my story, and I'm ready for any questions.
We're great for questions if you're going to move on to that part of the program.
Yes,
And I can help repeat anything if we need to.
okay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Franklin, for sharing your journey and experience with us. How question and answer is going to work is we're going to alternate between having questions that are in the community here, and people can come up to the microphone and ask their question. And any questions that are in the chat on YouTube will be asked as well. So we'll go every other as that makes sense. So if folks here in the sanctuary have questions, you can line up here to ask Mr. Franklin.
Good morning. Thank you so much for telling us your story. I was wondering if you had family members who were not fortunate enough to get out of Germany?
Yes. My father's parents, my grandparents on my father's side, were not part of this affidavit of support. So they remained back in Berlin. Unfortunately, we found out after we got to this country that they were deported from Berlin to a concentration camp in what was then Czechoslovakia. And even though we still got a few letters from them, those letters stopped Actually, the letters stopped when the war started. There was no more correspondence, but we did find out that they finally died in this concentration camp. We don't know, or we never will find out, whether they were killed or whether they just died of natural causes. They were pretty old people. And that I think answers that question.
Can you say, Mr. Franklin, about your father? What became of him?
What's that?
Your father.
My father?
Yeah.
My father worked in Paterson, New Jersey. He had friends from Germany that had settled there, and they arranged for him to get a job in a factory, a lamp factory. Finally, he wanted to be closer to where I lived, so he moved to Camden, New Jersey. And he got a job at Horn and Hardart Baking Company, which some of you may remember, and most of you will not remember. He lived to be 68, and he passed away in New Jersey.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. We have two questions. One is,
I can hardly hear.
how long was the train ride, like before you got on the ship? How
Yeah.
long did, and the
That-
other one was, have you been back to Germany?
Okay, that second question everybody asks, no matter where I talk. However, the train ride was slower than a peacetime train ride, but it was about a week, probably 5 days. I know we left, maybe I can tell you more exactly. We left on the 11th of March. My birthday is the 15th of March. On that day, we crossed from Spain into Portugal, and we got to Lisbon late on the 15th. So the train ride was 4 days, which is in normal times would have been 1, maybe 2 days. Now back to Germany. Yes, we went on a trip, with a group trip of ordinary people. I mean, not refugees, just Americans. And we went to through France and Belgium and Germany. And when we went to a sort of a buffet in a town in Germany, and the people behind the table who dished out the food, they talked a little English, enough to be able to take care of the people in the food line. And when I spoke to them in German, they said, "Boy, you can speak a good German." And I just thought to myself, I'm not going to tell you the story, but that's my mother tongue. All right, then I went to Berlin. Actually, that was on a separate trip. My daughter and her son-in-law and her husband, my son-in-law, lived in England at the time because he worked for an American banking company in London. And they were having their third child. And she was back and forth to the hospital and this and that. And she recommended that as long as we're in Europe, maybe I'd like to visit Berlin just for old time's sake, see the old city. Since my hobby in Berlin had been riding trolleys and buses, I knew the city very well. And that's what happened. We took the plane over the channel, went to Berlin, and we got off the plane. I went to the auto rental office. I want to rent a car. And the lady said, okay. I was speaking German, of course, at that point. I showed her, she wants to see my driver's license. Okay. I showed her my Pennsylvania, my Pennsylvania driver's license. She says, what's that? Never saw such a thing before. I said, that is from Pennsylvania, one of the 50 states of the United States. she was impressed. I got my car. I drove. I had to drive a gear shift, which I hadn't done in a long time. I stalled a couple of times, but I drove throughout the whole city of Berlin. And I remembered some of the spots I had visited before when I used to use trolley cars and buses. And I wanted to see certain things. I wanted to see the synagogue where I had been going for holidays and Shabbat, which was an Orthodox synagogue. And I found the place. I found the location. I didn't find the synagogue. It wasn't there. Instead, there was a statue, a big sign. It said, I said, and behind the sign, I saw children playing. It was a playground. But the sign said, on this site stood the synagogue of the Jewish congregation of Berlin, built 1908. That's all. Didn't say what happened to it. We don't know if it was bombed or if the Germans tore it down. Anyhow, I found the place. Then I wanted to find the apartment house where we lived. I found it very easily. I remembered the city very well. And so that was my trip to Berlin. We also visited, or wanted to visit, a Jewish synagogue, which we had no one in particular in mind, but we decided to go to the area where I went to the Jewish school in Berlin. And I found the street. There was no synagogue, but there was a Jewish bookstore. I went in and we asked, and they said, yes, there is, in the back building, there is services going on, Jewish services. We went back there, and it's true, there were Jewish people there. They were mostly speaking among themselves in Russian. They were not speaking German, certainly not English, not Hebrew, but they were speaking Russian. Well, but they could speak enough German so that I could get along. I found out that they had recently gotten out of Russia and now lived in Berlin. It was we stayed for the service and then we left. That was my trip to Germany since I was an American.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We have a question in the chat. Wanted to know if you witnessed Kristallnacht.
What,
Did you witness personally any of Kristallnacht?
yes, we at that point, that was November the 9th, 1938. We lived in this little village. They didn't get around to us until November the 10th, the next day. That's the day that I was thrown out of school. Now, the teacher, the principal who told me that I can't go to school there anymore, he was nice. I mean, he was a decent person, but he had his orders and I was out of school. Now, when I got home, I think I did mention before that they were destroying our furniture and our mirrors and things like that. And that's how I witnessed Kristallnacht one day late. And my uncle and my father had already been put into their cars, ready to be driven off towards the train that would take them to the concentration camp. That was my November the 9th, 1938. No, actually November the 10th for us.
Do you have any memories of anything in the
Okay.
town? Do you have memories of anything else in the town that may have been destroyed as a part of
No, not personally,
Pogromnacht?
not personally, but I know that my mother had a cousin. I called her an aunt, but she was a cousin who had a store in Berlin, one of the main shopping centers, something like our Chestnut Street might be here. Townsendstraße. She had a perfume business, ladies stuff, and her window was smashed. And the next morning, the policeman came by and said, "Clean up the mess on the sidewalk." And that's the one thing I know about, but I was not there and I did not see that at the time. Any other questions?
Yep.
Hello, thank you for the speech. I was wondering, when you mentioned that your uncle came back, did your uncle just come back easily just like that to help you out, or did it have a whole process?
I didn't quite get that. He came back, what?
From being in the concentration
Yeah.
camp, you mean?
He came back, bandaged up. He had frostbite on both of his hands. And of course, we took care of his bandages and all that. And he started telling us about the work they had to do without gloves. And this was in the winter time. They were building roads, stuff. It was a work camp, you know, what we would call a forced labor camp. But that camp was not a death camp. No, they did not actually kill people. Many of them died, but they were not shot or otherwise killed. But hard work, and especially for these people, many of whom were not used to that type of work. They were lawyers, they were doctors, they were people who had sheltered lives. But it was tough. He didn't really tell us too much about it, but he did say it was not just Jews. In this camp, they were Jews were separated from others. In one of the other sections of the camp were homosexuals. In another section, gypsies, and so different groups of people that the Germans felt were not true Aryans, Germans, racials. It was a racial separation, and I mean, from what I can understand now, Hitler was not against the Jews because of a religious reason. He was against the Jews because he considered Jews an inferior race. It was a racial thing. At least that's what I understand. I was too young to really understand it at the time.
Anyone else? Mr. Franklin, can you maybe, unless is there another question? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much for being here. I want to know if in Germany today, is it taught to children what happened to us?
Sorry, I couldn't.
She was wondering if the Holocaust is taught in Germany today.
I have no idea.
I can answer that question. I'm Dr. Ruth Almy. I'm the program director at the Holocaust Awareness Museum. So I can answer that question for you. It is actually very strongly taught in German schools. It's a requirement of German education. The German government funds through the government many memorials to the Holocaust, explaining it to the people. There are mandates about Holocaust education in Germany that are actually stronger than a lot of the mandates we have here in the United States. And it is actually illegal to be a Holocaust denier in Germany. You can be fined for it. We do not have such laws here.
Well, I'm happy to hear that myself.
Yeah.
I did hear about it before, but I wasn't really sure. Mhm.
Thank you.
Mr. Franklin, I'm wondering, what is it like to come to communities like Or Hadash and communities and tell this story? How does that feel to you?
I think that's the greatest thing I can do that will make my life worthwhile. I'm now 93. I hope to be 100 one of these days. And if I am, I'll continue to make these appearances whenever I'm asked to do so. And it's my pleasure to be able to talk, especially to young people.
Is there a final message that you would want to leave us with, Mr. Franklin, to especially the students that are here today?
What was that?
a specific message. What would you
Well,
want to
The message
impart?
is, the message is, we're Jews, we always will be Jews, we should be proud of it. Well, we shouldn't brag about it, but we should be proud of it. And even as I survived, hopefully there were others. And of course, we all know that there were millions who did not survive. And we cannot afford to forget that sad situation.
Great.
Anything else?
I think we have one more question from YouTube.
To what do you attribute your flexibility, your ability to change however necessary, considering all the horrific changes that you knew about?
Well, I was 13 when I came to this country. I had my 13th birthday when we crossed over from Spain into Portugal. 13 years old, it's easy to get used to new things. It's certainly easier than if I was 60 or 70 years old. But anyhow, even my grandmother, who came over as my grandmother, she was already in her 60s. She managed to do very well coming over to this country. When you come to a better place, it's easy to get used to the better things in life. Although I will say this, about 2 weeks after I came to this country, I got sick. And they called the doctor. And he said, he's had too much ice cream and whipped cream, which he had never had in his life before. That's what made him sick. Anyhow, I was happy to be sick for such reasons. And I was really a happy kid when I came to this country.
Thank you so much, Mr. Franklin, for sharing about your experience and your journey with us today. And it's really an honor to hear from you. And thank you for coming to Or Hadash this morning.
Okay, thank you for having me. This is one thing that I can still do. I'm too old to do much else, but I can still sit before a group of people and talk to them and explain to them that these are things that really happened, and that we, as a group of people, we Jews, have to know that we are fortunate to be in this country and be free, and we were able to have decent lives. And I am particularly happy for all the people that helped me grow up and go to school and everything else. I'm happy also to be here today to talk to all of you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to once again ask Dan to speak, and this time Dan is going to speak a bit about his grandfather and his personal connection to this issue.
Thank you, Rabbi Sarah. I also want to really thank you so much, Mr. Franklin, for speaking today and for your wonderful memories of, and important memories that you shared with us about your experience as a part of growing up in Germany, and really the trauma and the challenge of having to live through that time and separating from family in different ways. That really was challenging. And just hearing about, some of the, there's so much to reflect on. And I want to encourage our students and others in attendance at Or Hadash, if you would like to leave any reflections, thank you notes today for what you've heard from Mr. Franklin, to please do that before you leave. You can give it to Maura Barbara, and she will make sure to send all of your reflections and messages and thank yous to Mr. Franklin for today's presentation. It's never easy to go back in history, especially when you've been going through such a challenging time, from childhood, to be able to share this. And so I really appreciate the time and effort and energy, Mr. Franklin, that you put into this today. I want to now share a little bit of my grandfather, who you see standing in the middle there. And his name was Carl Schwartz. And he was a director of the Tel Aviv Museum of Art in Palestine, arriving in 1933 from Berlin, Germany. He was the director of the Museum of Art in Germany, in Berlin, and then came to Palestine in 1933. He wrote in the Haaretz newspaper, which was the newspaper of the time, the main newspaper in Palestine, his reflections of what was coming out of Europe, Germany, and Austria in particular. And so I would like to read an excerpt from what he wrote, reflecting on Pogromnacht. The flames that went up in the sky a few weeks ago in all the towns of Germany was a horror that was done to Jewish people. Never before was there such a focused, premeditated attack that within a few hours destroyed a few hundred synagogues. This attack was in addition to the ongoing persecution of the Jews. About 500 synagogues were destroyed. We have not yet received the exact number. This crime, the single most horrible in the history of the world, is for future generations to know the cultural value of the buildings destroyed by the people in power and the hatred that caused them to lose their minds. In this story, there will be witnesses who saw how the mob stampeded and destroyed these holy Jewish places. Religious artifacts were destroyed and the buildings were burned with torches, and they didn't leave until the peaceful houses of prayer were turned to rubble. Just as we remember the unknown soldier of the war with an eternal candle, there should be a memorial engraved tombstone with the names of all of the houses of prayer that were destroyed. And every Jewish holiday, there should be a special remembrance prayer for the victims of German hatred towards the people of Israel. All the synagogues in Europe that were destroyed, and among them many in Vienna and other towns in Austria, were destroyed. Everything was obliterated and beyond explanation. The destruction of the synagogues and the mountain of rubble testify to the shame and disgrace of a culture and a whole nation. We, who are working in the Holy Land to build our nation's future, it is our duty to build a memorial of eternal light that will remind us forever that Judaism lives in spite of the riots, and that you cannot destroy her under the arm of God's protection. Thank you. I also want to just raise briefly, before I turn this over to Rabbi Sarah for some concluding comments, and also to hear from Ruth Almy, who's going to share with us about HAMAC and all the great work that HAMAC does. You referred, Mr. Franklin, to HIAS, right, which is the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. That's HIAS. And they were instrumental in World War II to help and support Jews to be able to, leave the countries there that they were trying to escape. And Mr. Franklin shared how HIAS helped them. HIAS continues, as you said, Mr. Franklin, and it's an international organization active in the United States today, helping people from all over the world, in particular now from Afghanistan and Haiti, coming into the United States and helping support them adjust to coming to this country and so on. So I just wanted to highlight that, and I return that now to Rabbi Sarah.
Thank you, Dan, for sharing about your grandfather and sharing his powerful words. In just a moment, we are going to hear the words of Hannah Senish and the sounds and voices of the Makila, the choir here at Or Hadash, singing Eli, Eli. and just wanted to explain who Hannah Senesh was. Hannah Senesh was a Jewish woman who lived in Palestine at the time of World War II, at the time of the Holocaust. And she very bravely parachuted into Yugoslavia to try to save Jews, and her life was taken in that time. And we hear these words from her today, these beautiful poetic words. And I invite us to ground ourselves into the vision that she was looking for the world, a vision where we all can live with freedom and comfort and connection. And we will now hear the beautiful voices of our Or Hadash Makela. Thank you. I now turn it over to Jeff Quinn of HAMAC, the Holocaust Awareness Museum and Education Center, to tell us a little bit more about the work that you all do.
Except it's Ruth Almy instead. But go ahead, Ruth.
I'm the last minute stand-in for Jeff. I hope that's not disappointing. Thank you so much again to Mr. Ralph Franklin.
Ruth, could you take Ralph's microphone and hold it really close to you? That would be great. Now we'll hear you.
Thank you so much again to Mr. Ralph Franklin for speaking today. He's one of our wonderful speakers. We do this a lot. So HAMAC's main purpose is that we do educational programming and providing survivor testimony to schools all throughout the Delaware Valley and indeed all over the world. COVID had a bit of a silver lining for us, and now we can do virtual programs, and we do them even internationally. Most years we do several hundred programs, and last year I think we spoke to over 20,000 students, and that was low for us because that was in the 2020 year. We have recently relocated to Congregation Knesset Israel. We're on the second floor. We're on Old York Road 8339 in Elkins Park. We are also just recently reopened our exhibit of historical artifacts, and we are available for tours by appointment only. So please feel free to contact us if you'd like to book a tour, or if you're a teacher or know a teacher and would like to book a school program to accompany Holocaust education. Our programming is underwritten by our generous donors, and so it's free for any school who wants to have it. And we are happy to book a program for you. And our contact information is best found on our website, which is hamec.org, HAMEC.org. Thank you.
Really appreciate. I was muted. Thank you so much. It's been really wonderful to coordinate this program today with HAMEC, and then just so in awe and inspired of the work that you do. And a few other thank yous in order. Thank you to Josh and Adam for helping out with tech today. Thank you to Dan and everyone on the Holocaust Education Committee here at Or Hadash for the work that they have done to make this happen. Thank you to Maura Barbara and the Smile School and the Education Committee here at Or Hadash. And thank you to all of the students and parents who have been here today too. And of course, thank you to Mr. Franklin for being here today and sharing your story with us. And I'm holding on to the words that you shared, Mr. Franklin, from the rabbi, that what the rabbi told you before leaving Germany of don't ever forget what you saw here, and don't forget that you are a Jew. And I'm holding on to your words of be proud of being Jewish. You are a Jew, and what is the responsibility that we share in hearing these stories. And so in my closing remarks to you all today, going back to where we started of this idea of Lador Vador, holding on to what is our responsibility for building a world where nothing like the Holocaust ever happens again, and where we can build a world where everyone can live with freedom and dignity and comfort, and as proud Jews. And we at Or Hadash are really honored to have heard your story today, Mr. Franklin, and we will continue to share your story and other stories. And thank you again for everyone for being here.
Yes, everybody. Bye, everybody.